We're continuing our partnership with Learn Liberty this week, and joining me today is a professor of economics at George Mason University, an author, an anarcho-capitalist, and a pacifist. Bryan Caplan, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thanks a lot for having me.
A lot of good buzzwords in there, and we're going to get to all of them. But first, what's it like being a professor on a campus these days that doesn't identify as a progressive? Is that tough? Are you getting rocks thrown at you every day? How's that going?
My life is perfectly fine. Nothing bad's ever happened to me. I don't even know if I've ever gotten a negative comment on a student evaluation. To be fair, I'm in the economics department at George Mason University, which is a very unusual place. There's a lot of libertarian and free market oriented people there. But also, what I'd say is that the stories that you hear in the media, while generally true, you have to remember how many people are on campus, how many professors there are. So if every week you see some horrible thing happens to one professor, that still leaves 99.99% of all professors who had a perfectly fine week. And so far, so good for me.
Yeah, and you make a point of saying you're in the economics department, which is probably insulated from some of this stuff. Because you have to work with facts and figures and numbers. These are sort of outside of the realm of where social justice can hit, right?
Right, and also just, economics has a long history of a field where you can say really controversial and shocking things, and people are curious and want to talk about it in a civilized way rather than get really mad at you. So, I'd say at least half of the controversial ideas in academia have come out of economics, and economists get Nobel Prizes for these ideas. It's Gary Becker, Milton Friedman. It's not like people are waiting around for you to say the wrong thing and jump on you. To me, the real difference is just people who are very dull. There are economists who are very boring, but it's not that they're angry at people for doing other stuff. They're just not doing really exciting work. But there's plenty of room in economics for people to say almost anything, really, and not only get away with it, but to succeed. So, I've long been telling people, if you really want to be a professor, try to figure out how to repackage what you want to do as economics, and then just get a PhD in economics. You'll make more money, you'll get tenure, you'll get a job easily, and you'll be in a very supportive atmosphere where you can say what you want.
Yeah, I can tell you truly believe in the free market because you're welcoming people to take your job right now. That's pretty good.
Well, I do have tenure, so it's not not that worried in that way, but. And also remember that the more people, in order to become a professor, you first have to become one of my customers and go to grad school. So
naturally,
it's not as unself-interested as it might seem.
Yeah. Do you find that professors of economics, either at George Mason or you were just mentioning a debate you're doing in a couple of days, that generally professors of economics, from whatever whatever pathology they believe in, are able to debate and it doesn't get personal and it can really stick on the issues and that kind of thing?
So in general, I'd say yes. Again, the main problem is just people who are not interested in bigger ideas and only want to focus on narrow research topics. So people like that are not touchy, they're not hostile, they're just apathetic. Or they sometimes love the idea of, what you are doing is not science, and I don't really care about that, and you don't belong here. But it's not that they disagree with what you're saying as they disagree with people taking on bigger questions of any kind. Yeah. So that, again, that's sort of what I've dealt with in my time in academia is just, I want to do big, exciting ideas, and a lot of economists frown on that, not because they disagree with the content, but because they disagree with anything big and exciting.
Yeah. So before we get into some of your big and exciting ideas, do you find that generally, outside of the universities, that just the American populace really doesn't understand anything about economics? Because this is what I see all the time. I can only garner so much information from social media, but I see people saying things about trade all the time and immigration all the time and all these things that are tied back into economics. And I'm like, you don't really seem to know much about anything.
Yeah, so I have a whole book on this called The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies. In the book, I just go over all the evidence on what does the public actually believe about economics compared to what anyone who can explain the textbook thinks. And yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah.
The way I think about it is, right now, we're in LA, I grew up here. So I will say that until I was 17, I never heard any argument against the minimum wage. I never heard any argument against regulation of pharmaceuticals. I don't think I ever heard any argument against the welfare state, ever. And again, I was not growing up in Berkeley or some left-wing haven. I was just growing up in a normal, boring, middle-class suburb here in Los Angeles. But the kinds of arguments that economists make and are aware of are just not even on people's radar.
Yeah.
So
I think that's an important distinction, what you just said there, that you didn't grow up in Berkeley. You grew up in a suburb of Los Angeles that's somewhat blue collar. It was very
like middle class.
Middle class.
Yeah.
But
it was probably, could easily have been half Republican in those days.
Yeah.
And still, I'd never heard any of the very basic economic arguments critiquing standard popular regulations. So it's, I remember talking to my parents about rent control, and they didn't understand anything about the economist critique of rent control and how it causes a shortage of housing. For them, it's just like, well, we own a rental property, so we're against it. That was sort of all they could come up with.
Right.
But this is very very standard for not just the American public, but the global public, and throughout history is just the very basic ideas of economics that are in every textbook are not known, and when they're heard, this is the striking thing. So it's one thing to never heard them, but the normal reaction is just anger.
Yeah.
So say, well,
because they're so insulated from any other idea, basically.
Right, and also it just why are you saying this? Well, we have the minimum wage. It's a program to go and help poor people, and then an economist comes along and says there's a downside. This could cause unemployment, and people's reaction is, how could you say something like that? That's so terrible.
Yeah.
What kind of you hate poor people? And again, this seems like a parody, but I have experienced this firsthand plenty of times.
Yeah.
What
do you do with
agitated.
that? What do you do with that when you try to lay out something and you say, well, here's data to support it, but it's so emotional to somebody else, something like minimum wage or rent control.
Usually I try to connect it to firsthand experience, because anytime I talk about the data, then someone can say, well, it's your data. How do I know? There must be plenty of other people with other data. So try to say, well, look, when you fill out a job application, you get to the line on salary requirements, do you put $1 million an hour? No. Why not? Well, because I think if I put too much money, then I'm less likely to get the job. Aha! So it's not just me that believes that if wages are too high, that unemployment will result. You believe it too.
Yeah.
It's just that you don't want to connect what you know from your own experience to the world of policy because it doesn't sound good.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said about your parents. They had a rental property, so they didn't like rent control because obviously you don't want it if you're the owner of the property. And how we all apply our own life might be separate from what our philosophical principles are.
Yeah.
Because I lived in New York City for about 12 years in an apartment that was rent stabilized, so it's slightly different than rent controlled. But they could only increase my rent, I think something like, it would change every few years, but about 2% a year, which for me as the tenant was great. And they, over the course of 12 years, my rent started at $1,650 for a 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West, and I think it maxed out at about $2,000.
Oh yeah.
So as the tenant on my side, that's pretty great. Make the argument why I'm wrong about that.
Yes. So in terms of your own self-interest, you might be perfectly right.
Yeah.
I would say, well, there are some downsides. Things like quality tends to go down with rent control. So the heating breaks down, and you can't get landlord to come and fix things. So there is that. This is just a very standard result with any kind of price controls. If you can't adjust on the price, then you can adjust on all these other ways. You can adjust on quality, or you can try charging people for extras, things like that. But there's always going to be people who do benefit from the policies, and if you happen to be that person, then it's very, again, you might say, what's hard to convince them? The saving grace is that in general, people are not comfortable arguing for political policy or for policies on self-interested grounds. So, if you say, look, this is very bad for society, people normally want to dispute that it's bad for society. They don't want to say, well, sure, it's bad for society, but I'm one of them in the minority of people that's benefiting from this, so I like it and we should have it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the point that you make there about, well, they're going to have to cut in other ways if they can't raise your rent. So, for example, in my building, in the winter, every winter, there would literally be, if we were in the middle of a storm, there would be 3 or 4 days in a row where we would not have heat. It was an old steam heat, 4-story building. And there was a couple days when I was single back then that I literally was under the covers with my dog because I didn't want her to freeze either. And I went to the management building, which was a couple blocks away, and I was basically reaming them out. And I remember the woman was sitting behind bulletproof glass. And I thought, this is what's wrong with this system. This woman, she works for a big company. They own 500 buildings. We're stuck under this. I never fully connected that to rent control or rent stabilization.
And yet you were not inclined to move out to a full price place that had good heat.
Yeah. So that does show how
Yes.
we all sort of negotiate these strange things. So let's talk about anarcho-capitalism.
All right.
Because I haven't done much on it. I think I've had one anarcho-capitalist, my friend That Guy T on YouTube, who you should check out if you don't know him, great guy in Atlanta. What is anarcho-capitalism?
So anarcho-capitalism is the idea that the so-called minimal functions of the state are actually more than you really need. And it is not only imaginable, but it really could work to privatize the last lingering functions of government, like police, courts, and the law itself. Again, this is an idea that sounds really crazy. So the way that I usually like to explain it is, well, right now people may say, well, government clearly has to have a monopoly over police, monopoly over courts, monopoly over law. And I say government has a monopoly over these things right now. Right now, there's actually more private security guards than police. So
Is that really?
Yeah, that's true. So there are more people hired by business and communities to go and do policing than there are police in the official sense. And then so for courts, there is a huge area of private adjudication. There's arbitration. There's any time you have a problem with your credit card, do you sue the company that's involved? No, you call up the credit card company and they have their own internal adjudication system for handling things like this. Facebook, if you have problems on Facebook, do you go and sue Facebook? No, you go and you complain with them and they do something about it.
Yeah.
And then
I'm not sure they really do something about it in the case of Facebook, but maybe.
Well, the minimum, they give you a bunch of options to solve your own problem. You can block someone, you can unfriend them, you can make sure they never contact you again. So they give you a bunch of remedies that you have, which they've worked out exactly what it is they want to do about it.
Yeah.
And then similarly for law itself, there are many private organizations that have their own rules that they apply. So again, mentioning so private arbitration. One of the main reasons people use private arbitration is that they don't use regular laws. They use their own laws, which are designed to work better than the government's laws, so that you can get your issue resolved in a few days instead of weeks or years. Like usually with private arbitration, they have the arbitrator actually be someone who knows what he's doing. So they have someone who is in fact an expert on this area of business, rather than giving it to a generalist and 12 people who were too dumb to get out of jury duty.
Yeah.
So just sort of realizing, wow, so there's a lot of private alternatives that already exist right now.
Yeah.
To government providing these services that, at first glance, a lot of people just have the reaction of society would just burn in flames if there were private police or private courts or private law. Look around, it's not burning now, and there's already a very large role for the private sector.
Yeah.
So, and then when I think about anarcho-capitalism, I always just say, all right, well, let's start with what we got. You realize that is not going to lead to anything bad, and there's very good reasons why people are using these private alternatives right now, which is they're better. They're worth the money. You get better quality for not only for a lower price, but remember, these are private companies competing with free government services, and they're still carving out a big market niche for themselves because so many people are so dissatisfied with these services they get provided free by the government. And then just think about how much further can we take these? So very easy with private arbitration. Right now, one of the big limits on private arbitration is that even if you sign a so-called binding arbitration clause, in fact, if the person if a person doesn't like how the binding arbitration turns out, they can go and still sue you.
Go to the court.
Yes, they can take you to court. So, for example, if you sign binding arbitration saying, in the event of any employment dispute, this will be handled by private arbitration. That contract in general is while it might get enforced, there's no confidence that it would be. And again, if you think about it, well, yeah, suppose that you could sign this binding arbitration. I could get my brother-in-law to go and be the arbitrator. He always rules in my favor. You could use this to get around a great many government laws. So you can understand why government doesn't want to do this. And yet, clearly, you could go and allow a lot more room for private arbitration, and actually, it is likely that there is immense pent-up demand for private arbitration that is right now being stifled by regulation. Right, and then once you start thinking about how could there be even more, so one obvious one to me is if you go to government courts and they say, well, actually, if this is a private contract, you just have to have an arbitration clause, and it's not our problem. So if you want adjudication, put an arbitration clause, and all we do if there's a dispute is show us the contract. It says this is the arbitrator. Rubber stamp. That's it.
Yeah. So maybe as an intermediate step, you would keep criminal stuff in
Yeah,
the
exactly.
public system,
Yeah, exactly.
and remove some of this stuff that's purely legally
Right.
based.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think then when you just start thinking about all the things that you can hand over to the private sector, it is much larger than what it occurs at first. And then the anarcho-capitalist idea is really once we have privatized all the things that at first it seemed like you couldn't, but we just keep going further and further and further.
Yeah.
In the end, you're left with almost nothing. And then the question is, could you just get rid of that last bit?
Yeah, so let's pause on the last bit for a second, because you mentioned a few different areas there. So I think the arbitration one's really interesting. I'm wondering, when you see cases of arbitration now, it must self-select a certain type of person to go ahead and do that. What type of things are being fought in arbitration? You know what I mean? Like you'd have, I guess you'd probably have to have a certain amount of money. You would want to maybe know that the person across the table from you is in a similar situation or has similar views, that they'd be willing to accept it, because you just said at the end they could probably figure out a way to get this back into the courts.
I mean, it's fairly common actually just to add it in as boilerplate into a contract saying it will be arbitrated, but the people who really want it, I think, are people who've been burned by lawsuits in the past, people who've seen business deals just collapse before their eyes because a dispute came up and they didn't work it out, and then it took years for them to go and resolve it, and by then the business was bankrupt. So or of course, if you've been sued by an employee and you think it was bogus, that's the kind of thing. Like, I never want that to happen again. So these are some obvious cases of putting it in, but of course, no employer is thrilled about the idea of getting sued.
Yeah.
So if it were the kind of thing that you could really rely on, then I think it's very likely that it would be totally standard to put in private arbitration, and just to avoid all the hassles that are involved with hiring people right now.
Yeah.
Again, of course, if you think these laws are good, then this is very distressing to you. On the other hand, to someone like me, the fact that almost everyone would probably happily sign away the right to sue their employer shows there's something very, very bad about the system we have. It's like, look, it's the kind of thing that the right to sue your employer is the kind of right that people will sign away for a small amount of money.
Right.
Which means that it's probably not a very valuable right to begin with. It's the kind of thing that you're stuck with, and it's in many ways it's a burden, because then you have to convince an employer, I'm not going to sue you. I'm cool.
And well, isn't it also that the average person who works for even a small company, not just a giant corporation, we don't have lawyers on retainer. So I work for myself now, which is a pretty beautiful thing. But I've worked at plenty of companies where the day I got hired, I had to sign some crazy book of all these. And of course I didn't read all that stuff. It's like, I'm not walking around with a lawyer, and most people aren't. So most people are just signing stuff without even knowing what they're signing.
Right, which I would say is, thank goodness for that, because if people were actually taking it more seriously, and right now I think firms are taking advantage of that to go and dilute it as much as the law will allow. And again, I think that since I think the regulations are bad in the first place, I'm all for people diluting the regulations as much as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's an old saying, thank God we don't get as much government as we pay for. I say also, thank God we don't sue people to anywhere near the extent that we legally could. Right. Because it would be a hellish world.
Yeah. This may sound like a very amateur question, but when people go into arbitration, are you bringing a lawyer with you, or is it just that the arbitrator is just looking at what was signed and deciding? Like, is there an actual argument that's taking place?
Right. So I think it varies a lot. So sometimes you might bring a lawyer. So it may actually depend upon the rules of the arbitration. But I think a lot of the idea is just to cut the expenses down. So I think a lot of times you don't have a lawyer, you just have an arbitrator there who generally is well versed in the industry that you're working in, so he actually knows what you're talking about. And then, of course, part of what they're doing, so there's something more moderate called mediation, where the arbitrator where the person doesn't really get to decide anything, but just tries to get the two people to talk. It's kind of like counseling. And then arbitration is stronger, where he listens to both sides and then he tells you what's going to be. Right.
Is there always a set time frame on how long that lasts?
No. Well, so certainly not always. Again, since this is private, there's there's a wide range. There's a beautiful rainbow of all possibilities, which are all done. So, there's, sometimes there's an arbitrator who just says, look, we meet tomorrow. That's it. It's rubber, end of story. Here's what's going to happen. And again, part of the beauty of that is once you get the dispute resolved, a lot of times you can go back to working with each other. Yeah. You may not be that happy about it, but there's no longer an ongoing dispute, and so it's settled, and then you can get back to business.
Right, and you haven't paid an insane amount to lawyers.
Right.
So I assume lawyers aren't thrilled with these ideas.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, so of course there's some who are entrepreneurial enough to see, well, this is an opportunity for me to branch out. But yeah, I think it would be very bad for lawyers in the long run, and of course for litigators particularly, which is a small minority of lawyers in the first place. But So I mean, like for a contract lawyer, this might be awesome because then there'd be a bunch of people who want to rewrite all their contracts to go and putting binding arbitration that's truly and utterly binding.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that even policing could be privatized.
Sure.
But what would happen? So I can understand that in a place like Beverly Hills. People have got a lot of money. We're going to privatize the Beverly Hills Police Department. Beverly Hills Cop. Okay, I saw the movie. That wasn't what the movie was about, but I had to get that in there somehow. But what about in a place where the economics are terrible, where people have no money, where probably crime is the highest? Who's going to put in money to? How are you going to make a profit off that?
Yeah. So key thing to realize, places where crime is terrible are ones where the current police already don't work very well. So we're stepping back and realizing the current system is quite crummy to begin with. Now, who would pay for it otherwise? So, the obvious place to start are people actually are landlords. So, like in a more suburban area, you're talking about homeowner associations are some of the obvious people to pay for it. But, even now in bad areas, it's very common for landlords to pay for some kind of security, and if they know that it's their job to do it. And again, in a high crime area, even someone who is poor values their life, values protection. So like an economist joke has been, you see a lot of really expensive sneakers in bad areas of town, but so why is this? Well, when it's a priority, people will come up with the money in order to pay for things that they really care about. But the other thing about policing is, I think it's also better to think about it in a broader category of just enforcement of all kinds. So, there's many kinds of enforcement besides actual police. So one that's become, very common with the internet is, all kinds of reputational incentives. So, just like bad reviews, things like this, these work far better than the FDA. So, imagine you get a bad meal. Do you go and call up the FDA and complain about it or something like that? Or like local meat inspectors? No, much more likely to go and put in a bad Yelp review. And this is the way that we are probably getting most of our actual enforcement. From what is protecting you from food poisoning? Is it the government? No, the government's hardly doing anything about it. What's really protecting you from food poisoning is word of mouth, which is now amplified because now it is word of the internet. One complaint. So my dad runs an internet business. One disgruntled customer is terrible for you, and is really a much more effective enforcement mechanism than anything the government is doing about it.
So is some of it that it just, the messaging has to be clearer? Because that concept seems very obvious to me in a day of the internet.
Right.
Where you're right. People care now more about what a Yelp review of a restaurant says than what either a written review in the LA Times says or what what it says at the restaurant, what they're telling you themselves. So this is really about messaging in a way more than economics, because I think people can get there economically.
Yeah, and then again, also just thinking about ways that you can get a contract between people that you don't ordinarily think of as a contractual relationship. So right now, if you get an accident with someone, a car accident, you don't have a contract with the person you got an accident with. But if you both have insurance, your insurance company has a relationship with their insurance company. So of course, most auto accidents never go to trial. The insurance companies have a system that they work out where they negotiate with each other. They've got standards. So again, that's already going on. And then just think about anytime you're in a public place, anytime you're in a mall. Right now, of course, if there's a dispute there, the police will handle it. But it is very easy to visualize a world where when you go to the mall, there's actually a sign saying so when you enter this, you come under the jurisdiction of this arbitration company. And then any dispute that happens in a mall then is no longer actually needs to be handled by the police. And again, of course, people saying, well, they're just rent-a-cops. They don't even have, a lot of them don't really have guns. Of course, if the taxpayers will pay for someone to be shot at, then companies are not going to pay the extra amount to have their employees shot at.
Right. So the whole system of economics would sort of flip if we changed it.
Yeah. So the amazing thing about all of the kinds of private law that we see right now isn't that how little it does, but how much it does, given that the government provides these services free of charge, and people still will take money out of their own pockets to go rather than go and get the free stuff. Which, so, of course, it's always, in a sense, it's not free because you have to pay taxes, but in another sense it is free, namely, you can use it without any additional charge. So that's the sense in which this stuff is free. I guess sometimes you'll get charged for a false alarm, although that's pretty unusual, but I think fire departments sometimes, if you call them for no reason, they'll give you a bill, say why did you go and waste valuable services, but normally that's not how it works.